My name is Tiffany Wright, and I was 35 years old when I realized that loving someone unconditionally doesn't mean protecting them from the consequences of their choices. For most of my adult life, I believed loyalty meant standing beside the person you love no matter what, even when the ground beneath you started to shift. I just didn't realize how far that belief would carry me right up to the moment everything fell apart. 2 years earlier, my life looked exactly like the kind people describe as stable. I lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Virginia with my boyfriend Daniel Wright and our two daughters. Lily, who was 11, already had that sharp, observant way of looking at the world, and Emma, 9, still believed most problems could be solved with hugs and cereal for dinner. We weren't flashy, we weren't wealthy, but we were steady, or at least I thought we were. Daniel and I had been together for over a decade. We met in college when he was charming in that effortless way, creative, thoughtful, the kind of man who could turn a random Tuesday night into something memorable just by deciding it mattered. When the girls were born, he threw himself into fatherhood with the same passion. He used to invent elaborate bedtime stories complete with ridiculous voices, and he never missed a school event unless work absolutely demanded it. I worked in medical device sales. It sounded impressive, but in reality, it meant long hours, pressure-filled meetings, and being very good at convincing people to trust me. Daniel had once worked in marketing, but after Emma was born, we decided together that he'd stay home for a while. It made sense. He was better with schedules, crafts, and creativity. I was better at spreadsheets and negotiations. We were a team. For a long time, that balance worked. Then, Margaret Daniel's older sister re-entered our lives in a different way. She'd gone through a brutal divorce a few years earlier after her husband cheated. I'd felt genuinely terrible for her. She'd been shattered, angry, humiliated. When she started posting endless quotes online about empowerment, self-worth, and reclaiming feminine energy, I chalked it up to healing. People cope in strange ways. Who was I to judge? At first, her presence felt harmless. She came over, often sat at our kitchen table with Daniel while the kids were at school drinking coffee and talking about purpose, identity, and not shrinking yourself for anyone. I didn't think much of it. Daniel had been restless lately. The kids were older. He had more time. I figured Margaret was helping him feel less stuck. But looking back, that was the first crack. Daniel started talking differently. Not just about wanting a hobby or a project, but about needing something more, something that belonged to him, something meaningful. I remember the night he brought it up clearly. He was pacing our living room, animated in a way I hadn't seen in years, talking about creativity, fulfillment, and how many people were building entire brands online. "I just don't want to feel invisible anymore," he said quietly. That should have scared me. Instead, I felt proud that he trusted me enough to say it out loud. When he pitched the idea, a spiritual wellness product handmade mindful, rooted in intention, I listened. I asked questions. I encouraged him, because that's what supportive partners do. I didn't know yet that this was the beginning of the end. At the time, it felt like hope. If I'm being honest, the first few weeks after Daniel decided to pursue his spiritual wellness business were some of the happiest I'd seen him in years. He woke up early again. He talked with his hands. He laughed more. It felt like I'd given him oxygen after watching him slowly suffocate in quiet dissatisfaction. That alone made every doubt I had feel selfish. So when he asked if I believed in him, really believed, I said yes, without hesitation. I meant it. The business itself sounded harmless enough. Handmade wellness products, soaps infused with intention, calming scents. Crystals meant to amplify positive energy. I didn't fully understand the appeal, but I understood people, and people were clearly buying into that world. Daniel had always been creative. Marketing had once been his strength. So I told myself this was simply him finding his way back to himself. I didn't just offer emotional support. I invested financially and practically. I covered the startup costs without complaint. A few $1,000s to get supplies, a clean website, professional photos, inventory, software. I helped him set up payment systems, pricing structures, shipping logistics. Late at night, after the girls were asleep, I'd sit at the dining table with my laptop open, walking him through projections and margins while he talked about brand identity and spiritual alignment. We joked that I was the boring corporate half and he was the soul. Margaret was suddenly everywhere. She framed herself as Daniel's guide, his sounding board. She talked constantly about reclaiming power, about how women had been conditioned to make themselves small, and how men too could be trapped by outdated expectations. I didn't disagree with everything she said. Some of it made sense, but the way she spoke about me always indirectly made my skin itch. Comments like, "Not everyone can handle growth," or sometimes, "Partners feel threatened when you evolve." Daniel never corrected her. That silence lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest. At first, the business actually worked. Orders came in, friends bought products, then friends of friends. A local yoga studio started carrying his soaps. Daniel lit up every time he packaged an order. He let the girls help choose scents and colors, turning it into a game. They loved it. I love seeing them excited about something their dad created. I told everyone how proud I was of him. I meant that too. But gradually, pride turned into justification. Daniel started referring to himself as an entrepreneur, then a founder, then, half-jokingly at first, a CEO. The language changed before the behavior did, which made it easier to ignore. He spent more time online watching videos, joining groups, absorbing jargon. Everything became about mindset, about abundance, about how scarcity thinking was toxic. The house adjusted around his new identity. Meals became rushed. Homework checks were inconsistent. If something slipped, I picked it up without complaint. I told myself this was temporary, that every new venture required imbalance before equilibrium returned. I'd seen it before in other couples. This was just a phase. Margaret encouraged every step. She praised him constantly, reinforced the idea that he was on the brink of something big. When I raised small concerns, nothing confrontational, just questions about expenses or time, she'd smile thinly and say things like, "Tiffany, growth is uncomfortable. That's how you know it's real." Daniel would nod along, not meeting my eyes. The money going out started matching the money coming in, then surpassing it. Courses, workshops, conferences. Every purchase was framed as an investment in the future. When I asked if we should slow down, Daniel accused me gently at first of not trusting him. That hurt more than I expected. Trust had never been our issue, or so I thought. The shift at home was subtle but relentless. Daniel missed Lily's first basketball game. He apologized, distracted, already planning his next post. Emma's teacher emailed about unfinished homework. Daniel promised to handle it and forgot. I handled it instead, again. One night after I picked up takeout, because he was in the middle of something important, I stood in the kitchen watching him photograph soap bars under expensive lighting I'd helped pay for. The girls were in their rooms. The house smelled strongly of essential oils. Daniel looked happy, focused, alive. I remember thinking, this is the cost of loving someone through change. I didn't know yet how high the final bill would be. The moment I first heard Lauren Hale's name, something in me tightened. Daniel came home from a weekend business conference glowing in a way that felt excessive. Not just energized, but altered, like someone who'd found religion and expected the rest of us to convert immediately. He paced the living room, barely stopping to breathe, talking about vision scale and alignment, about how meeting the right mentor could change everything. Lauren Hale, according to Daniel, was exactly that. She was a business coach, a visionary, someone who helped heart-centered entrepreneurs step into their highest potential. I looked her up later, perfect teeth, polished confidence, a feed full of luxury locations, and inspirational captions that said very little while promising everything. The kind of woman who knew precisely how to look like success. The price of her coaching program nearly knocked the breath out of me. 5 figures. For guidance on selling soap. Daniel had already paid the deposit before telling me. When I stared at him in disbelief, he didn't apologize. He explained. Explained how this was necessary. How Lauren had helped others scale to levels we couldn't even imagine. How I needed to stop thinking small. Margaret was thrilled. She talked about Lauren like she was some kind of prophet, helped Daniel prepare for their calls, reminding him to dress well, to show up energetically aligned. I laughed the first time I saw him in a button-down shirt and styled hair for a video call. The laughter died quickly when it became routine. The sessions were always in the evening, always important, always non-negotiable. Dinners shifted later. Bedtime routines fell apart. If Lily or Emma asked why their dad couldn't come help with something, Daniel would say later without specifying when later might be. Later rarely came. Then there were the in-person strategy meetings, always in upscale hotels or trendy coffee shops. Never in office, never during normal hours. He'd come home late, buzzing, talking about breakthroughs and next levels. Sometimes he smelled different, not like essential oils, something sharper, expensive. When I brought up how absent he'd become, he accused me of not understanding entrepreneurship, of clinging to outdated ideas about family roles. You're scared of change, he told me once, his voice calm and patronizing in a way I barely recognized. That's your stuff, not mine. The girls noticed everything. Children always do. Emma started asking why Dad was always busy. Lily stopped asking altogether which was worse. One night I found Lily sitting on her bed, staring at her phone, tears streaking her face. She'd won a school award that day and wanted to tell her dad. He was on a call, again. That was the night I started paying attention. I didn't confront him. I watched. I documented. Late nights, missed events, unexplained charges, hotels near the locations of these meetings. My chest hurt constantly, like my body knew what my mind wasn't ready to accept yet. Part of me hoped I was wrong, that this was all just ambition spiraling out of control, not betrayal. I wanted an explanation that didn't end with my children watching their family fall apart. Then came the text message that erased every remaining doubt. It was from Lily. Mom, Dad is at the mall with Lauren. They're kissing. Emma is crying. Please come get us. I don't remember much of the drive. Just the sound of my heart pounding in my ears and my hands shaking on the steering wheel. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my marriage, or whatever was left of it, was already over. By the time I reached the mall, my entire body felt detached from itself, like I was moving through water that resisted every step. Lily was standing near the entrance with her phone clutched tightly in her hand, her face pale and unreadable. Emma was beside her, crying openly, shoulders, shaking mascara from some kid's play makeup smeared under her eyes. The sight of them like that, confused, exposed, forced into a reality they were never meant to witness, snapped something inside me so cleanly it almost felt quiet. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need answers. I pulled them into my arms and held them there while Emma sobbed into my jacket and Lily stood stiff like she'd already aged 10 years in the last 20 minutes. When I asked where their father was, Lily just pointed, her jaw clenched. I didn't look. I didn't want the image burned into my brain when it was already clear enough. The drive home was worse than the drive there. Emma kept asking why Daddy was kissing that woman. Lily said nothing at all, staring out the window, her silence loud and accusatory. I told them we'd talk later, that everything would be okay, knowing even as the words left my mouth that they were a lie. Some things don't go back to okay. They just change shape. I sent the girls to their rooms when we got home. They didn't argue. That hurt more than if they had. I paced the kitchen, my hands trembling, staring at my phone like it might explode. Every memory from the past year rearranged itself into something ugly and undeniable. The late nights, the new clothes, the sudden defensiveness. I'd funded it all, encouraged it, built the scaffolding for my own collapse. Daniel came home around 7, practically glowing. He was talking before the door even closed behind him, rambling about breakthroughs and alignment and how today had changed everything. He didn't ask where the girls were, didn't notice the tension in the room. I let him talk until he finally looked at me and saw my face. I held up my phone, Lily's message still open. The transformation was immediate. Confusion, panic. Then, astonishingly, a laugh. A short, dismissive sound, like I'd just told him something mildly inconvenient. He said the girls must have misunderstood, that kids exaggerate, that nothing was what it looked like. When that didn't work, he shifted. Started talking about energy alignment, about how his connection with Lauren was spiritual, not physical, that it was part of his growth, part of stepping into his truth. I don't remember raising my voice, but suddenly I was shouting. The words came out sharp and raw, bouncing off the walls, demanding how he could justify doing this in front of our children. He rolled his eyes. Actually rolled them. Told me I was being dramatic, that I was stuck in old paradigms, that I was holding him back. That was the moment I knew the man I loved was gone. When I called Margaret, hoping stupidly that she'd be as shocked as I was, she didn't even pretend. She admitted she'd known, had been covering for him, had booked rooms, made excuses. Her voice was calm, righteous, convinced she was on the right side of history. By the time my parents arrived, the house felt like a courtroom without rules. Daniel played the victim. Margaret played the defender. My mother tried to mediate. My father said very little. And then Lily came downstairs. She looked at all of us, her voice steady and flat, and said, "Dad doesn't care about us anymore. He cares about Lauren, and Aunt Margaret helps him. No amount of empowerment language could undo that truth. That night, something fundamental shifted, not just in my relationship, but in me. I stopped wanting explanations. I stopped hoping for apologies. I started thinking about protection, about consequences, about how to make sure my children never had to watch their parents' failures become their burden again. I didn't sleep, I planned. People think explosions are loud. They imagine screaming matches, slammed doors, public meltdowns. What they don't understand is that the most devastating damage usually happens in silence, in the space where someone stops arguing because they've already decided they're done. That's where I was. I didn't cry anymore. I didn't beg. I didn't even yell. I moved into a different mode entirely, one that Daniel never saw coming, because he was too busy congratulating himself for choosing growth. The morning after everything came out, Daniel didn't come home. Margaret had convinced him it would be emotionally unsafe for him to stay, while I was still operating from what she called a wounded mindset. He texted me something about needing space to recalibrate. I didn't reply. Instead, I called a lawyer during my lunch break, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I scheduled a consultation and started a folder on my computer labeled simply documentation. I didn't take money out of spite. I took it out of necessity. I opened a separate account and redirected my paycheck there. I froze shared credit cards. I changed passwords. Daniel noticed eventually, of course. He called me furious, accusing me of financial abuse, of trying to punish him for outgrowing me. I listened without interrupting, then calmly told him that until we sorted things out legally, our finances would reflect our reality. Separate lives, separate responsibilities. The shift was immediate. His confidence wavered the moment abundance had an actual price tag. Meanwhile, his business, the one I'd helped build from the ground up, started collapsing under its own weight. Orders went out late. Customer complaints stacked up. Refund requests piled in faster than he could ignore them. Without my logistical support and quiet behind-the-scenes management, the cracks became impossible to hide. Lauren stopped responding as frequently once payments became inconsistent. Funny how spiritual alignment has limits when invoices aren't paid. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't have to. All I did was tell the truth where it mattered. Honest reviews, accurate timelines, no emotion, no accusations, just facts. Other customers followed. The illusion shattered quickly once people realized they weren't alone in being disappointed. Margaret tried damage control, posting long, dramatic messages online about betrayal, resilience, and toxic partnerships that fear-empowered men. She painted herself as a warrior Daniel, as a misunderstood visionary. It might have worked if the evidence hadn't been so obvious. Screenshots don't care about narrative. Receipts don't respond to inspirational captions. At home, I focused on the girls. We reestablished routines. Dinner at the table. Homework checked. Bedtime stories read by someone who showed up. Lily relaxed slowly, her sharp edges softening as consistency returned. Emma stopped asking when Dad would come home. That silence hurt, but it was honest. Daniel's calls became more frantic as reality closed in. The coach vanished entirely once the money dried up. The sister who had promised him empowerment couldn't pay rent herself. The empire he'd been so sure would save him couldn't even sustain him. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something close to peace. Not because he was suffering, but because I was no longer carrying him. Court doesn't look like television. There are no dramatic gasps, no clever monologues that turn the tide in a single sentence. It's fluorescent lights, uncomfortable chairs, and the slow, methodical stripping away of illusion. By the time we stood in front of a judge, Daniel no longer looked like a visionary. He looked tired, smaller, like someone who had finally realized that slogans don't hold up under oath. He tried at first to reclaim the narrative. He talked about burnout, about losing himself, about how the pressure of family life had pushed him towards something that felt meaningful. He spoke softly, carefully, like a man who had practiced his lines. He framed his absence as sacrifice, his affair as confusion, his choices as unfortunate but understandable detours on a journey of self-discovery. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't roll my eyes. I let him talk. When it was my turn, I didn't talk about betrayal. I talked about facts, bank statements, dates, missed school events, emails from teachers, Timelines that showed exactly where he was supposed to be and where he chose to be instead. I talked about stability, about consistency, about children who need parents more than they need philosophies. My lawyer guided the process with surgical precision, laying everything out without drama. And then the judge asked if the children were willing to speak. That was the hardest part. Lily walked up first, her shoulders squared in a way that made my chest ache. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. She simply described what it felt like to come second, to watch her father choose phone calls over her games, strangers over his own family. Emma followed quieter her words, halting but clear. She talked about feeling scared when no one came to pick her up, about crying alone in her room, about not wanting to live somewhere she didn't feel noticed. There is no empowerment language in the world that can compete with a child telling the truth. The decision was swift. Primary custody to me, supervised visitation for Daniel until further review. The judge's tone was firm, but not cruel the way someone sounds when they've seen this story too many times to be surprised. Daniel looked stunned, like he'd truly believed his intentions would outweigh his actions. When the papers were signed, I felt something lift. Not triumph, relief. The kind that settles deep in your bones when a long illness finally breaks. Outside the courthouse, Daniel tried to speak to me. Apologize. Explain. I listened politely, then told him this wasn't the moment. Maybe there would be one someday, maybe there wouldn't. What mattered was that our daughters were safe, and that was no longer negotiable. That night, I slept for 8 uninterrupted hours for the first time in months. Life didn't snap back into place once the divorce was finalized. It settled instead, slowly and deliberately, like dust after a collapse. The quiet in the house felt unfamiliar at first, not empty, just honest. No constant hum of ambition, no late-night pacing, no phone calls whispered behind closed doors, just mornings that began on time, dinners eaten together, and children who stopped flinching when their phones buzzed. Lily joined the school basketball team again. She played harder than before, like movement itself was a release. Emma's grades climbed once someone was consistently there to check her homework and sit beside her when she got stuck. The house smelled like normal things again, clean laundry food simmering on the stove instead of sage, and essential oils meant to cleanse energy that never should have been there in the first place. About a month after everything was legally over, there was a knock on my door around 9 in the evening. Not firm, not confident, the kind of knock that apologizes for existing. I knew who it was before I opened it. Daniel stood there thinner, worn down, the certainty that once wrapped around him like armor completely gone. His clothes were rumpled. His voice shook when he spoke. He told me he was done chasing visions, done being an entrepreneur, done pretending he knew what he was doing. He said he'd made a mistake, that he wanted to come home. I didn't laugh. I didn't yell. I just looked at him, really looked, and realized that the man in front of me wasn't the person I'd lost. He was someone else entirely, someone who had already made his choices and was now standing in the aftermath, asking me to absorb the consequences. I told him no, not because I hated him, not because I wanted revenge, but because I had learned something vital in the ruins of everything he'd burned down. Love without boundaries is just another form of self-destruction. I wished him clarity. I wished him growth. I closed the door. Through family gossip, the kind that never really dies, I heard that Margaret had quietly retreated from her empowerment crusade. The post slowed, then stopped. She moved on to a new narrative, one that framed everything as a lesson the universe needed her to learn. I didn't engage. Some stories don't need rebuttals. They collapse on their own. I started dating again slowly. Coffee conversations, men who showed up when they said they would. Nothing dramatic, nothing spiritual, just real, and that was enough. The garage is clean now. The shelves once stacked with unsold products are empty. I donated most of it without ceremony. But I kept one thing. A single bar of soap, purple and cracked with a small crystal embedded in the middle. It sits on my desk at work, a quiet reminder. Whenever I have a hard day, whenever something feels overwhelming, I look at it and remember how easily illusion can masquerade as purpose and how reality always wins in the end. Not loudly, not cruelly, just inevitably.